The desert stretched endlessly beneath the burning sun, its silence broken only by the uneven sound of hoofbeats in the distance. A figure stumbled through the sand, her steps heavy, her body trembling from blood loss. The young Apache woman pressed her hand against a deep gash along her arm, but the bleeding wouldn't stop. Dust clung to her dark hair and painted her cheeks with streaks of earth and sweat. Each breath was shallow, each step more uncertain than the last. She fell to her knees, the desert swallowing her small frame as though it meant to bury her alive. Behind her, faint shouts rose. Riders, white men, determined to hunt her down. Fear knotted in her chest, but she no longer had the strength to run. She pressed her forehead to the ground, voice breaking in a whisper that carried more pain than sound. "Please, don't hurt me." Just beyond the ridge, a man on horseback slowed. Jacob Hunter. The solitary ranch of the town only spoke of in hushed tones. Rein in his horse, his sharp eyes narrowing against the glare of the sun. He had been on his way back from checking fence lines when he saw her, a crumpled shape of blood and dust in the sand. For a moment, he thought she was just another casualty of the unforgiving land. But then she lifted her face, and their eyes met for a fleeting second. Jacob froze. He had built his life on silence, on staying away from other people's troubles. Trouble always meant pain. And this woman, she was trouble wrapped in blood and desperation. His first instinct was to turn his horse, to ride away before the riders chasing her turned their eyes on him. But something in her eyes, the raw terror, the plea for mercy, rooted him in place. The shouts grew louder. Dust plumes in the distance marked the men who hunted her. Jacob's hand tightened around the reins, his mind torn. He could leave her here, pretend he never saw her. That was a safe choice, the choice he had made 100 times before when life tried to drag him into wars that weren't his. But as she collapsed fully into the dirt, whispering words that cut straight into the hollow of his chest, Jacob knew this was different. With a curse under his breath, he swung off his horse and strode toward her. The Apache woman tried to push herself up, but her body gave out, leaving her sprawled across the desert floor. Jacob knelt, his shadow falling over her broken form. She flinched, expecting a blow, expecting more cruelty. Instead, his voice came low, rough with compassion he hadn't felt in years. "Easy now. I'm not here to hurt you." She blinked up at him, unsure whether to believe. The last man who had offered her kindness had betrayed her, delivering her to the ones who wished her gone. Trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. But his eyes, storm-gray and haunted, did not carry mockery or violence. They carried loneliness, the kind that mirrored her own. Behind them, the riders' cries drew closer. Jacob glanced at the horizon, then back at the fragile woman at his feet. He had only seconds to decide. Leave her to die, or carry the burden of saving her, a burden that could bring the whole town's wrath crashing down on his head. For a man who had sworn to keep his life untouched by anyone else's pain, the choice was a knife against his own rules. Yet as the Apache woman's whisper broke the desert air again, softer this time, weaker, "Please don't hurt me," Jacob felt his decision settle like iron in his chest. He lifted her into his arms, her blood staining his shirt, her weight lighter than he expected. He swung her onto his horse, his jaw set like stone. When the riders crested the ridge minutes later, the desert wind carried nothing but silence and empty tracks. Jacob Hunter was already gone, carrying a wounded stranger who would change the fate he thought he had buried forever. The ranch stretched wide under the empty sky, miles of fencing, weathered barns, and cattle grazing slow under the sun. It was alive, but its master was not. Jacob Hunter moved through the land like a ghost, feeding the stock, repairing broken posts, riding the borders every morning as though it was routine carved into his bones. Yet behind his steady movements lay a hollowness, so deep it swallowed the man he used to be. Years ago, fire and sickness had taken his wife and their unborn child, leaving him with nothing but memories and a silence that clung to the cabin walls like a curse. Since then, he had lived by a single law: stay alone, stay out of trouble, let the world pass by. In town, they called him cold, untouchable. Some whispered that he had no soul left to give, that he preferred the company of dust and cattle over people. Jacob never cared what they said. Keeping his distance meant keeping his heart safe. Trouble in all its forms was a storm he refused to invite again. But now, as the image of the wounded Apache woman replayed in his mind, her whisper cracked with fear, her eyes carrying the same kind of brokenness that lived inside him. His rules faltered. He had told himself to ride away, to let the desert claim her. Instead, he had lifted her into his arms. Instead, he had brought her here. Inside the dim cabin, Jacob stood by the hearth, watching as she lay unconscious on the narrow bed. Her breathing was shallow, her skin pale beneath streaks of dirt and blood. He had cleaned her wound, bandaged her arm, and given her water. That was more kindness than he had shown another soul in years. His chest tightened with unease. He had broken his rule. This was not his fight, not his burden. Yet, as the firelight flickered across her face, he realized something he didn't want to admit. The woman was no longer just a stranger. She was a mirror to his own loneliness, proof that pain lived in others too. Jacob turned away, his jaw set, hands braced against the ruffle of the table. Trouble had found him again, no matter how hard he tried to keep it out. And though every instinct told him to send her away once she was strong enough, a quiet voice inside whispered the truth. It was already too late. The rules he lived by had begun to break the moment he saw her eyes. The storm outside had passed, but inside the cabin, silence pressed heavier than thunder. The Apache woman stirred on the bed, her dark hair clinging to her sweat-dampened face. Jacob sat across the room, oil lamp glowing low, sharpening his knife out of habit, not to scare her, though he knew it did, but because he needed the motion, something to keep his hands from betraying the unease curling inside him. When her eyes flicked open, they were sharp and wary, darting around the cabin before fixing on him. She flinched, tried to push herself upright, but her wound pulled her back down with a hiss of pain. Jacob moved forward slowly, his voice gravel-soft. "Don't. You'll tear it open again." Her gaze burned with mistrust. He could see the thought behind it. Another white man, another betrayal. She had every reason to believe so. He knew the stories, had seen the cruelty of settlers with his own eyes. She pulled the blanket higher, as if it were a shield against him. "Why?" she rasped, her accent thick, but her meaning clear. "Why help me?" Jacob had no good answer. He only shook his head. "Didn't seem right, leaving you to die in the dirt." His words did not soften her suspicion. She turned away, staring into the flickering fire, her body tense, as though ready to flee despite her broken state. The hours stretched long. Jacob finally ladled stew from the pot and set a bowl beside her bed. The scent of venison and potatoes filled the cabin, warm and grounding. She hesitated, eyes narrowing, as if expecting poison. He sighed, lifted his own spoon, and ate from his bowl without a word. Only after watching him swallow did she finally reach for the food with trembling hands. It wasn't gratitude she showed. Not yet. It was survival, and he respected that. Later, as the fire popped on the hearth, they shared that strange, heavy silence. Two strangers bound by circumstance, not trust. Jacob's presence filled the room, solid but not pressing. Her eyes kept flicking toward him, testing, measuring. He noticed a small scar near her temple, the way her fingers curled tight around the blanket, like it was her last offense. She noticed his rough hands, the quiet strength in his shoulders, and the weariness in his eyes that matched her own. Neither spoke, but something unspoken hung in the air, a recognition, fragile and uncertain. That night, as Jacob stretched out on a cot near the door, he stared into the shadows and felt the shift begin. He had given her shelter, food, a chance to heal. She had given him nothing yet, not trust, not words. But for the first time in years, he wasn't entirely alone. Somewhere between firelight and silence, a seed had been planted. It was too small to name, too fragile to touch. But it was there. The morning sun baked the dusty town streets as Jacob tied his horse outside the general store. He had wanted to bring her along, but the Apache woman had insisted on coming, her stubborn pride refusing to remain hidden in his cabin like some secret shame. Her wound had healed enough for her to walk, though her steps were still careful. The moment her feet touched the street, heads turned, conversations stilled, whispers rose like a wind of venom. The rancher's hiding an Indian. Apache trash under his roof. Jacob felt the weight of 100 eyes on them. And for the first time in years, the town looked smaller, meaner. Inside the store, silence thickened. A woman sneered as she passed, clutching her child closer, whispering just loud enough, "Savage doesn't belong here." A man chuckled at the counter, spitting tobacco into a tin. Guess the cowboy's gone soft. Taking in scraps the rest of us would shoot. The Apache woman froze, her jaw tight, her hands trembling as she clutched the basket Jacob had given her. For years she had endured hatred, betrayal, and broken promises. But somehow the open cruelty in this moment sliced deeper than old wounds. Her breath caught, not from pain, but from humiliation. Jacob's hand still on the counter, knuckles whitening. He hadn't cared much for the town's judgment of him before. Recluse, widower, haunted man. But seeing her shrink beneath their words stirred something sharper than pride. Slowly, he stepped closer, his voice carrying across the store, low and steady, cutting through the sneers. "She's under my roof," he said, every word like iron striking stone. "Which means she's under my protection." The room fell silent. The man at the counter swallowed, eyes darting away. The woman with the child flushed red, muttering before hurrying out. No one dared laugh again. The Apache woman's eyes flicked up to him, wide and wet with a storm she could not hide. No man had ever stood for her like that, not without demand, not without cost. In her world, kindness always carried a price. Yet here he was, shielding her from the hatred of his own people, without asking for anything in return. For the first time since she'd been dragged into his cabin, something in her chest loosened just a little. Trust, fragile, unfamiliar, flickered like a fragile flame in the dark. As they left the store, baskets heavy with supplies, she walked beside him in silence. Dust swirled at their boots, the town stairs still burning their backs, but she no longer felt entirely exposed. She glanced sideways at him, catching the set of his jaw, the quiet strength in his stride. Her whisper was barely audible, but he caught it. "Why risk yourself for me?" He didn't look at her, didn't slow his steps, because no one deserves to stand alone. That night, back at the ranch, the firelight flickered across their faces once more. She sat closer than before, her basket of mended cloth resting beside her, her eyes softer though still wary. He didn't push her, didn't ask for gratitude. But when their gazes met across the flames, something passed between them. Recognition, respect, and the first fragile thread of belonging. Branded by two worlds, hated by both, they had found one place where they weren't alone. Under the same roof. The fire crackled low, painting the cabin walls with restless shadows. She sat near the hearth, her hands trembling slightly as she mended a torn piece of cloth, though her eyes were far away, lost in memories she had long buried. Silence had stretched between them for days, a silence made not of discomfort, but of unspoken truths pressing to be released. At last, she set the cloth aside, her voice soft, almost breaking. "They took everything," she whispered, staring into the flames. "My people, my family, betrayed by those who promised peace. White soldiers came a word of friendship, and when we laid down our arms, they brought fire instead. My mother, my little brother, they didn't survive." Her throat closed as she forced the rest out. "I ran, but running doesn't make you less haunted." Jacob sat still, his jaw tight, his chest heavy with the weight of her confession. He had seen Apache raids, had heard the stories whispered in town. But sitting across from her, flesh and blood, pain etched deep into her eyes, he saw not an enemy, but a soul carved by grief no different from his own. Slowly, he leaned forward, the firelight catching the weary lines of his face. "I lost him too," he said, voice low and gravel-edged. "My wife, my two little ones. A fever took them quick, before I could even pray it away. I buried them myself out on the hill. And since that day, I've been living like a man already buried beside them." The room grew heavy with the weight of their wounds, two broken worlds meeting in the quiet glow of the fire. She looked at him, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Then why," she began, voice trembling, "why carry me? Why take on another burden when your own is already so heavy?" Jacob held her gaze, steady, unwavering. His words came slow, but each one struck like a vow. "You're not my burden," he said, his voice rough but certain. "You're my choice." Something shifted inside her then, a crack in the wall she had built so fiercely around her heart. For years she had been unwanted, a ghost, a reminder of blood and loss. And here was this rugged cowboy, scarred and hollow, choosing her not out of pity, not out of duty, but out of something she could not yet name. Her lips trembled into the smallest of smiles, the first real one since she could remember. Jacob's hand, roughened by years of rope and reins, brushed against hers as he reached to take the mended cloth from her lap. It wasn't a claim nor a demand, just the quietest touch, steady, grounding, warm. Their eyes met once more in the glow of the fire, and for a fleeting moment, the cabin no longer felt haunted. The silence between them had changed, no longer empty, but filled with a fragile promise of something new, something alive. The night was still, the only sound the restless hiss of the prairie wind against the cabin walls. Jacob had just doused the lantern when the distant thunder of hooves shattered the quiet. His hand went instinctively to the rifle resting near the door, while her eyes widened, body stiffening as old terror flooded back. Through the window, faint torchlight flickered in the distance, bobbing closer. Too many riders for a neighborly visit. Jacob's jaw set tight. He didn't need to guess why they were coming. The bandits, or worse, vigilantes hungry for blood, stormed into view, torches raised, shouts tearing across the darkness. "Hand over the Apache squaw," one voice bellowed. Another spat. "She don't belong here, cowboy, unless you want her fate to be yours." The words burned like brands. She froze, every muscle screaming to run, but Jacob's voice came low, steady as iron. "Stay behind me." He stepped onto the porch, rifle cocked, silhouette cut sharp against the firelight. Gunfire cracked the silence first. The night erupted into chaos, bullets slamming into wood, sparks flying as a torch struck the barn. Jacob fired back with deadly precision, dropping one rider from the saddle. She clutched the bough she kept hidden in her bundle of things, her fingers trembling but sure. When a bandit broke from the others, charging straight for the porch, she let an arrow fly. It struck true, knocking him clean off his horse. For a heartbeat, Jacob turned to her, stunned. She wasn't the helpless victim they thought. She was a warrior in her own right, but the fight was far from over. Two men forced their way into barn, setting hay ablaze. Smoke poured thick into the air, choking the night. Jacob rushed to cut them down, but in the frenzy one attacker came from behind, raising a knife high. Her scream cut through the smoke, sharp and desperate. She didn't think. She lunged, grabbing the heavy iron skillet from the fire and slamming it against the attacker's skull. The man crumpled at Jacob's feet. His eyes flickered to hers, something fierce and proud in his gaze. "You saved me," he rasped. The flames were dying now, the raiders scattering, wounded and beaten. Silence returned in ragged breaths and the crackle of smoldering embers. The ranch stood battered but alive, just like its guardians. Jacob dropped his rifle to the dirt, his hands shaking from more than just a fight. She sank against the porch rail, her chest heaving, ash streaking her face. For a long moment, they just stared at one another, raw and unguarded. Then, as if pulled by some unseen force, Jacob knelt before her. His hand found hers, rough palm brushing her callous skin. Their foreheads nearly touched, their breaths mingling in the smoky air. The world shrank to the space between them. Unspoken confessions, unshed tears. His lips hovered just shy of hers, trembling with everything he wanted but couldn't yet claim. She closed her eyes, the smallest smile ghosting her lips, her whisper trembling. "I'm not afraid anymore." The kiss didn't come, not yet, but the promise of it burned hotter than the flames that had tried to consume them. For the first time, they weren't just two broken souls surviving. They were standing together, blood and fire forging something stronger. Trust. The ranch was quiet again, but the silence felt different now. Smoke from the burned barn had long faded, leaving only the heavy weight of what they had endured together. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, its glow painting their faces in amber. Jacob sat across from her at the wooden table, his hands clenched, knuckles white. He had fought bandits with bullets, yet tonight he wrestled with a war inside his chest. He couldn't keep the words locked away any longer. At last, his voice broke the silence, low and rough like gravel. They see an enemy when they look at you. But me? He lifted his eyes, letting her see the rawness he never showed anyone. I see the only woman strong enough to heal me. The words struck her deeper than any wound ever could. Her lips trembled, her hand rising to cover her mouth as tears welled. She had been branded curse her whole life, unwanted, cast aside. And here was this man, this lonely rancher, daring to name her the answer to his prayers. She shook her head, choking on the confession trapped in her chest. All my life, I was told I was nothing, a burden, a curse, even my own people. Her voice cracked as the tears spilled freely. No one ever wanted me, not as a daughter, not as a wife, not as a woman. The room blurred, her pain flooding out in sobs. Jacob stood, his chair scraping the floor, and in 2 strides he was kneeling in front of her. His calloused hands took hers, steady and warm, grounding her in a way no one ever had. His gaze held hers, fierce and unshakable. "Then they were all blind," he whispered, "because I see you. I see your fire, your courage, your heart, and you are not unwanted. Not here, not with me." The words broke the last wall inside her, and before she could stop herself, she leaned into him, her forehead pressing against his. For a heartbeat, the world stood still, just the sound of their ragged breaths and the pounding of 2 hearts that had carried too much pain. Then, without hesitation, Jacob's lips found hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was desperate, aching, filled with every wound they both carried and every hope they had buried. She clung to him, her tears wetting his cheek, but neither pulled away. The kiss was mercy. The kiss was fire. The kiss was life returning to 2 souls who thought they had none left to give. When at last they broke apart, forehead still touching, her lips curved into the faintest smile through the tears. "This cabin," she whispered, glancing at the rough-hewn walls that once felt like a prison of loneliness. "It doesn't feel empty anymore." Jacob's arms tightened around her, his breath warm against her hair. "That's because it's not," he said softly. "Not anymore. Not ever again." The fire crackled brighter, as if echoing their vow, its glow wrapping them in warmth. The cabin that had once been a hollow shell of grief now pulsed with life. Not just shelter, but home. Outside, the vast land still held its dangers, its whispers of hate and prejudice. But inside these 4 walls, they had carved out something sacred. In the stillness of that night, the cowboy and the wounded Apache woman found what neither thought possible: healing in each other's arms. The weeks that followed the attack changed everything. Rumors still whispered through the town, but they no longer carried only venom. People had seen the rancher fight for her, not out of duty, but out of choice. They had seen the Apache woman stand shoulder to shoulder with him, driving back armed men with courage fiercer than most men of the territory. Slowly, curiosity replaced hatred, and respect began to grow like wildflowers in cracks of stone. Where once there had been only scorn, now there was a grudging acknowledgement. Perhaps this woman was not an enemy at all. The ranch, too, seemed to breathe again. Broken fences were mended, burned boards replaced. The soil turned and sown anew. She worked beside him, her hands blistered, her brow damp with sweat, yet her spirit unyielding. Every corner of the land bore both their touch, her quiet strength and his steadfast will. What was once Jacob's lonely burden became their shared purpose. The sound of laughter began to echo across the pastures, soft and rare at first, until it became as natural as the wind moving through the tall grass. In town, the change continued. Some still sneered, unwilling to forget old prejudices, but others began to nod respectfully when they passed by. A few even spoke with her, testing the waters of civility. When one merchant, out of spite, refused to sell to her, Jacob had placed his money down firmly and declared in front of all, "Where she is unwelcome, so am I." That moment spread faster than wildfire, and for the first time she was not just feared or pitied, she was defended. That loyalty began to silence tongues more effectively than any weapon. Yet for her, The true transformation was not in the town's shifting glances, but within the walls of the cabin. She had walked into it once as a hunted woman, whispering for mercy. Now she moved through it freely, her touch softening its edges, her presence filling its hollow spaces. The firelight no longer reflected loneliness. It glowed with shared meals, quiet laughter, and moments where silence itself was a comfort. The cabin was no longer a hiding place. It was home. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, they sat together on the porch. The land stretched wide and golden before them, a canvas of endless promise. She leaned lightly against him, her head resting near his shoulder, her hair catching the last rays of light. He reached for her hand, rough with work yet tender in its hold, and the weight of all they had endured hung between them. It was time for words that had lived in his chest too long. His voice was steady, low, carrying the weight of both a vow and a prayer. "You'll never whisper for mercy again," he said, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. "With me, you'll always be safe. You'll always be loved." Her breath caught, eyes filling, but this time her tears were not born of fear or sorrow. They were the tears of a heart that had been shattered and was finally whole. She turned to him, her lips trembling with a smile, and whispered back, "And you'll never be alone again." The horizon stretched out before them, endless and clear, no longer shadowed by grief or fear. In that moment, it felt as though the world itself had shifted, from pain to peace, from exile to belonging. Two wounded souls, once broken and abandoned, had found in each other not just survival, but something far greater, a love strong enough to heal the deepest scars. And as the sun dipped beyond the land they now called theirs, the future opened before them, a promise of eternal companionship, of a home built not just of wood and earth, but of hearts bound together forever.